From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Administrator Scott Pruitt, thank you, Scott, very much. EPA is doing really, really well. And, you know, somebody has to say that about you a little bit. You know that, Scott.
Calls are growing for EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt to resign as he faces more than a dozen ethics investigations. But behind the scenes, he's radically reshaping the EPA. The chemical industry has just been handed a major victory as the EPA scaled back the way it determines the risks of the most dangerous chemicals on the market. Then, as protests resume in Gaza, we look at how the Israeli military is attempting to frame the Palestinian medic Ghassan al-Najjar, who was shot dead last week by an Israeli sniper. And we go to Afghanistan, where Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has announced a temporary ceasefire with the Taliban, a move hailed by NATO.
This is a positive step forward on the path to peace. NATO fully supports an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace and reconciliation process.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Donald Trump and other leaders of the world's largest economies have gathered in Quebec City, Canada, for this year's G7 summit, with the U.S. president increasingly isolated over trade and climate change. The G7 meeting comes after President Trump ordered tariffs on imported steel and aluminum from Canada, Mexico, China, Japan, and the European Union, prompting world powers to talk of uniting against the U.S. in a trade war. Reuters quoted French President Emmanuel Macron as saying Thursday, "We don't mind being sick if needs be." Macron echoed that comment in a joint press conference with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
The 6 other countries of the G7 represent a larger market than the American market. Let's face it, there is no world hegemony if we find a way to organize ourselves, and we don't want there to be.
President Trump is scheduled to leave the G summit early ahead of next week's meeting in Singapore with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. With his early departure tomorrow morning, Trump will miss a discussion on climate change, which will center around Trump's decision to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. This comes as Trump said Thursday he's prepared to invite Kim Jong-un to the White House if next week's summit between the two leaders goes well. Federal agents arrested a former senior aide to the Senate Intelligence Committee Thursday, charging him with repeatedly lying to the FBI in a probe of who leaked classified information to reporters. The arrest of James Wolfe came just hours after the New York Times reported it had discovered federal agents had secretly captured years' worth of phone and email data from New York Times reporter Ali Watkins, who broke several high-profile stories related to the Intelligence Committee's work for the New York Times and other outlets. The Times reports Watkins and Wolfe previously had a 3-year romantic relationship. A New York Times spokesperson blasted the Trump administration's efforts to spy on its reporter, saying, quote, "Freedom of the press is a cornerstone of democracy, and communications between journalists and their sources demand protection," unquote. This all comes exactly 1 year after the Trump administration arrested former U.S. intelligence contractor Reality Lee Winner, who's accused of leaking a top-secret document claiming Russian military intelligence launched a cyber attack on at least one U.S. voting software company just days before the 2016 election. Reality Winner has pleaded not guilty and remains jailed awaiting trial. The Trump administration said Thursday it will not defend key parts of the Affordable Care Act as a number of states, led by Texas, challenge the constitutionality of President Obama's signature health care law. In court filings, Justice Department lawyers sided with the Republican-led effort to overturn the ACA in a move that would allow insurance companies to charge more or refuse coverage to people with pre-existing medical conditions. This came as the White House lobbied Republican congressional leaders to vote down a bipartisan bill that would fully fund an expansion of veterans' health care that Trump signed into law on Wednesday. On Capitol Hill, Senate Democrats are urging House Republican leaders to hold a vote on a bill that would reverse the FCC's repeal of net neutrality rules. Without congressional intervention, the FCC's new policy will go into effect Monday. It would allow Internet service providers, ISPs, to throttle Internet traffic speeds according to how much customers pay or based on which websites they wish to favor. Last month, the Senate voted 52 to 47 to reverse the FCC's rollback of net neutrality rules. On Thursday, the entire Senate Democratic caucus sent a letter to Republican House Speaker Paul Ryan demanding he bring a companion bill to the House floor. The Trump administration said Thursday it's transferring about 1,600 immigrants held in ICE custody to federal prisons in the first large-scale transfer of this kind. ICE told the Reuters news service it's moving the prisoners to 5 federal penitentiaries, with the majority headed to a prison complex in Victorville, California. Most of those being transferred have no criminal records and are awaiting civil immigration court proceedings. The Northwest Immigrant Rights Project reports up to 120 people being held at SeaTac Prison in Seattle are asylum seekers who are separated from their families. Meanwhile, a high school student from Iowa was found murdered in Mexico's Zacatecas state in May, just 3 weeks after he left the United States under threat of deportation. Manuel Antonio Cano Pacheco was found with his throat slit in what his family believes was a gang-related murder. He was just 19 years old. Cano Pacheco was brought to the U.S. when he was just 3. He'd previously been granted protected status under President Obama's Deferred Action or Childhood Arrivals program known as DACA, which President Trump has been working to phase out. After he was convicted of 2 minor drug charges, he lost his DACA status and chose to enter Mexico as deportation appeared likely. In Brooklyn, New York, immigrant rights groups and elected leaders are calling for the release of a delivery worker who was arrested by ICE last week after he dropped off a pizza at the Fort Hamilton Army base. Pablo Villavicencio, an Ecuadorian immigrant, presented his New York City-issued ID card to soldiers at the entrance to the base, as he's done on many previous delivery runs. But this time, he was denied access and told he needed a driver's license to enter the base. After a military police officer ran a background check, he discovered an ICE warrant from 2010 and called in immigration agents. Villavicencio is now being held at an ICE detention center in New Jersey and is scheduled to be deported. On Wednesday, New York City Council member Justice Brannon spoke to reporters outside the gates of the Army base, accompanied by Villavicencio's wife, Sandra Chica, and the couple's 2 young daughters.
Does the Army now have some new policy that demands all non-military personnel show proof of citizenship to gain access onto the Army base? Otherwise, what happened here? Is this part of some new Donald Trump deportation strategy? You're tearing families apart for what? How are we any safer today than we were yesterday?
It's cruel that they're gonna separate my daughters from him. He's supporting the family. Now I'm gonna be by myself along with 2 kids.
On Thursday, scores of protesters gathered outside Immigration Court in Lower Manhattan chanting, "Free Pablo now." Meanwhile, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has said his office will pay Villavicencio's legal fees. In Nicaragua, hundreds of mothers marched to the streets of Managua Thursday, calling for justice for the more than 100 sons and daughters killed by police and vigilantes in recent protests, calling on President Daniel Ortega to resign. This is protester Ana Maria Pizarro.
Children are showing up having been tied up, tortured, and beaten up. And many times, after many days of complaining, the authorities call on mothers to collect the bodies. Official organizations should be giving information on victims from day 1.
Britain's highest court ruled Thursday Northern Ireland's near-total ban on abortions is incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. The ruling by Britain's Supreme Court won't require a change in Northern Ireland's laws, but pro-choice activists say it's a step towards forcing the government of Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May to intervene. This is Grania Teggart, Northern Ireland campaigner for Amnesty International.
Theresa May must now demonstrate that, like us, she trusts all women in the UK and that she will end the inequity that women in Northern Ireland face. They should not have to travel to the rest of the UK for this health care. So we will continue to pressure our government to change the law to enable free, safe and legal abortions in Northern Ireland.
Ontario, Canada, voters have elected a new Conservative government led by Doug Ford, brother of the infamous former mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford, who died of cancer in 2016 after battling drug and alcohol addiction while in office. Doug Ford, who many have compared to Donald Trump, saw his progressive Conservative Party win the most votes in provincial elections. Speaking on Democracy Now!, journalist Naomi Klein called Ontario's election the most important of her lifetime.
What's really, really worrying about this is that he's running on this platform to cut taxes in various ways, to cut corporate taxes, to cut individual income taxes, to do away with Ontario's cap and trade policies. And so it's a plan to blow a massive multi-billion-dollar hole in the budget, but he has refused to say how he will pay for it.
To see our full interview with Naomi Klein about Ontario's election, you can go to democracynow.org. New weather data show the month of May was the hottest ever recorded in the contiguous United States, with temperatures soaring more than 5 degrees Fahrenheit above 20th century averages. Climate scientists say May's heat toppled the previous record set in 1934 at the height of the Dust Bowl and is consistent with models for global warming. The record U.S. temperatures came as 2018 is on track to be Earth's 4th hottest year on record, while the 5 warmest years on record all have taken place since 2010. Celebrity chef and television presenter Anthony Bourdain has died by suicide. The 61-year-old man was found dead in his hotel room in Strasbourg, Germany, where he was filming an episode of his CNN program Parts Unknown. Anthony Bourdain's death came just days after fashion designer Kate Spade was found hanged to death in her Manhattan apartment in an apparent suicide as well. The high-profile suicides come as the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention report the U.S. suicide rate has risen by over 25% over the past 2 decades. Topping the list is North Dakota, where suicides have risen by 57% from 1999 levels. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt is again facing a slew of ethics and spending scandals amidst mounting calls for his resignation. On Thursday, The Washington Post reports Pruitt enlisted members of his $3.5 million security detail to pick up his dry cleaning and search for his favorite skin moisturizing lotion, even though federal rules prohibit public officials from receiving gifts from subordinates, including unpaid services. This comes after congressional transcripts surfaced showing Pruitt had one of his top aides, Milan Hupp, go apartment hunting for him in violation of federal ethics standards. Hupp was also instructed to try to get Pruitt a used mattress from the Trump International Hotel. After the Washington Post broke the story, Hupp announced her resignation. Her last day is today. Also resigning amidst the mounting scandals is Pruitt's senior counsel, Sarah Greenwald, who traveled internationally across the U.S. with Scott Pruitt as he met with industry officials and foreign diplomats. Meanwhile, Pruitt has also faced criticism after it surfaced his former scheduler contacted the chief executive of Chick-fil-A, seeking to set up a personal meeting about the possibility of Pruitt's wife, Marilyn, opening a franchise of the fast food chain. The revelation is based on emails obtained by a Freedom of Information Act request filed by the Sierra Club. On Wednesday, journalist Jessica Smith published a video of her questioning Pruitt about the Chick-fil-A scandal.
With great change comes, I think opposition. I mean, there's significant change that's happening across not only at the EPA, but across this administration, and it's needed. Look, my wife is an entrepreneur herself. I love, she loves, we love. Chick-fil-A is a franchise of faith, and it's one of the best in the country. And so that's something we were very excited about. So, and we need more of them in Tulsa, and we need more of them across the country. So anyway, it's an exciting time.
The New York Times has also reported in recent days Pruitt attended a University of Kentucky basketball game last December in seats belonging to Joseph W. Kraft III, a billionaire coal executive who is aggressively fighting to reverse Obama-era rules limiting coal pollution. All these news scandals come as Pruitt was already facing at least a dozen investigations over spending and ethics violations, ranging from his close ties to industry lobbyists to illegal spending of public money. Meanwhile, Pruitt is continuing to radically reshape the Environmental Protection Agency. The New York Times reports today the EPA has given the chemical industry a big victory by scaling back the way the federal government determines health and safety risks associated with the most dangerous chemicals on the market. Pruitt has also been accused of radically reshaping the EPA rulemaking process and weakening Obama administration efforts to tighten fuel economy standards, among others. For more, we're joined by Robert Weissman, president of Public Citizen. Last year, Public Citizen launched corporatecabinet.org, a website tracking the corporate connections and conflicts of interest of Trump's cabinet appointees. But, Rob, today we're going to focus on Scott Pruitt. We're going to divide this into two parts. Talk about the slew of scandals, and then we'll talk about what some consider the greatest scandal, and it is the rolling back of environmental protection. Rob Weissman.
Thanks, Amy. It's good to be with you and your viewers and listeners. You know, if you listen to the introduction you just gave, Washington is very familiar with people who come and try to self-enrich themselves from the taxpayer pot, but I don't think we've ever seen anything like Scott Pruitt. That list of examples, most of which have just emerged in the last week or two, I don't think there's ever been anything like that. And there are more. You know, last week it came out that he was buying $130 pens because he thinks he needs to write with $130 pens. And what we've seen is a guy who, first of all, has no respect for the taxpayer and his duty to be frugal and guard taxpayer assets. But more importantly, a guy who thinks that he should live like the billionaires that he's serving. You know, he's hanging out with these super rich people, and he doesn't see himself any different than them. They get to fly around all over the world whenever they want to do, you know, on luxury planes, and so should he. And they get to sit at the front row of college basketball games, and so should he. They get to eat in fine restaurants whenever they want without regard to paying, and so should he. One of the other stories that's come out in the last couple of days is he's going over to the White House dining hall so frequently because there's great food there at a very low price, sort of luxury level food at McDonald's prices, and they told him, stop coming. You're coming here too often. And so there's this an unbelievable degree of entitlement and desire for luxury, which is not appropriate for a government official. But I think it does connect to the second strand of what you're talking about. Part of the reason he thinks he's entitled to this, besides his own megalomania, is he's hanging out with people who live like this, and he doesn't see why he shouldn't be able to do the same thing.
Can you talk about the women who've just resigned, his top aides, lawyer and assistant?
Right. Well, these are people he brought over with him from Oklahoma. He was formerly the Oklahoma Attorney General. And he used them in considerable part to take care and tend to his personal whims and desires. You know, one of these aides who was effectively his executive assistant, but had a high-level title and a high-paying job, was scheduling his personal trips. You know, he wanted to go to the Rose Bowl, so she worked that out. Then it emerged, as you were saying, in the last few days, she actually was looking for apartments for him. She visited at least 10 apartments, the House Oversight Committee discovered, to try to find one for him after he got thrown out of the flop house he had, the super discount deal from a lobbyist or a lobbyist's wife.
Well, wait, explain that. I mean, that deal that he had was staying in the building of an energy lobbyist's wife, getting a deal from an energy lobbyist, in essence, paying $50 a night when he was there, but the room was held open for him always, the apartment.
Yeah, it's exactly as you said. So he's paying $50 a night, which is, let's say, below market rates here in Washington, D.C. He wasn't even paying every night. He was only paying for the nights he stayed, and that wasn't as many as you might think because he is jetting all around the country and the world to tend to his desires and whims. The discount deal was being provided by a lobbyist couple. The husband had business before the Environmental Protection Agency, which was a fact denied but now revealed, in fact just revealed in the last few days as the husband had to change and fully disclose on his lobby forms what he'd been doing. And there's just never been anything like this. So there are some hard ethics questions in Washington, D.C., but none of the things involving Scott Pruitt are hard ethics questions. And again, they're just startling kinds of misbehavior, but they're startling kinds of misbehavior that matter, not just because, like, what does he need $130 pens for, but because he's doing favors for the people who are conferring benefits on him. So
or $3.5 million in security. I want to turn to a postcard addressed to Scott Pruitt, sent to the EPA's Seattle office last year. The postcard featured an image of a man standing on an iceberg. It read, quote, "Dear Mr. Pruitt, climate change is real. We're watching you. For the sake of our planet, our children, and our grandchildren, will you be a reasonable man? I repeat, we are watching you." It was signed by 7 first names of women. Well, this postcard is on the potential list of potential threats to Pruitt's safety that the EPA used to justify a 24/7 security detail that has cost taxpayers at least $3.5 million.
Right, it's just part of the grandiose story around Scott Pruitt. So he's got this 24/7 security detail that former EPA administrators have not had and for which he has no reason. He uses these people to sort of create a bubble around himself when he travels, to put on screaming sirens and take him to his favorite restaurants in Washington, D.C., to protect him from citizens who might come up to him and complain about what he's doing. And, as you say, to do weird things like find his favorite moisturizer.
So let's turn to this latest news. We're going to take a break and then come back to it. And that is one of the top headlines today, top story of the New York Times, the Trump administration, after heavy lobbying by the chemical industry, scaling back the way the federal government determines health and safety risks associated with some of the most dangerous chemicals in the market. We'll be back with Rob Weissman, president of Public Citizen. Brian Jonestown massacre. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at the record of Scott Pruitt, is he about to resign or be fired? That's the question. The New York Times reporting today the EPA has given the chemical industry a big victory by scaling back the way the federal government determines health and safety risks associated with the most dangerous chemicals on the market. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt has also been accused of radically reshaping the EPA rulemaking process, weakening Obama administration efforts to tighten fuel economy standards. Still with us, Rob Weissman, president of Public Citizen. Rob, talk about this latest news about the chemicals in the air we breathe, in the soil, in the water we drink.
Yeah, this is the real outrage. So the stuff we were just talking about, that's funny for the soap operas, and it is crazy, outrageous in its way, but it's not really hurting people in the same way this is. So this breaking news from the New York Times is that the agency, the EPA, is going to change the way it assesses chemical safety. It's now looking at beginning a new process after a recently passed law of evaluating the safety of chemicals that have long been on the market. It's looking first at 10 and then it's going to go on to others. And the short version is it's changing the way it's going to do it so that chemicals will be deemed safer than they otherwise would have been. It'll be higher levels of exposure will be possible, more use of dangerous chemicals will be possible. How do they get there? Well, this is the real scandal at the EPA. The person in charge of the review is an industry chemist who came from the Chemical Industry Trade Association. She's now in charge of setting up the process. So she is delivering for the agency from which she once came. The impact is going to be on people whose names we don't yet know, but people will die as a result of this. So when you look at what they're doing in the chemical industry, or how Pruitt and his top aides are benefiting the coal industry, or enabling more air pollution, or taking care of the agribusiness industry, or making sure we've got more oil and gas burning going on, he is enabling a kind of corporate violence that will kill literally tens of thousands of people every single year. We don't know their names, but they will die. He is looking at rolling back on behalf of the oil and dirty energy industries an air pollution standard, one air pollution standard that is expected to save 11,000 lives every year and prevent 130,000 asthma attacks every year. Again, when those things happen going forward, if he succeeds in rolling back this rule, almost no one's going to go back and say, look, it was Scott Pruitt who enabled this. It was the industry that polluted in my neighborhood that forced my child to have an asthma attack. People don't think that way, but it is what happens. So it is a crime and a violence that is equivalent to street crime, except that it's at a much more gigantic scale than anything that the biggest mass murderer could ever hope to accomplish.
I wanted to go back to a story we covered last week. Officials with the EPA barring multiple journalists from covering a summit on water contamination at the EPA's D.C. headquarters, with one journalist reporting she was shoved out of the building by security guards. The reporters were from CNN, the Associated Press, E&E News. The journalist who was shoved, Ellen Nickmeyer of AP, was ultimately allowed into the meeting in the afternoon. The meeting was about nationwide water contamination from the chemicals PFOA and PFOS, which are used in Teflon and firefighting foam. The attempt to exclude some journalists from the meeting comes as EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, who spoke at the meeting, was, of course, facing the slew of scandals around him. We had an extended conversation about this. This is about people trying to get a report released of areas, communities around industrial sites, around military bases that fear this contamination.
Yeah, that's right. So the big story at EPA in this regard is because Scott Pruitt's agenda is taking care of the polluters and the donors, and of course himself, full stop, has nothing to do with science, has nothing to do with evidence, and won't let evidence get in the way of what he's trying to do. They don't want any media coverage of what they're doing. They don't want internal staff to tell the truth, so they're pushing out as many people as they can, and even in one case trying to hire a PR agency to effectively do external scrutiny of their internal employees to see who might be trying to do their job. They don't want anyone to mention climate change, the biggest threat facing humanity, and they're stripping from their data sets information on climate change. They are refusing to consider real science in their rulemaking processes and now trying to change the overall rulemaking process so to exclude important parts of environmental science and public health science. They are working in every possible way they can to reach predetermined results on behalf of polluters. You know, for a long time, the deregulatory forces in the country say, look, well, all we want is more evidence. Let's just do more studies. Let's do more studies. And studies was sort of their excuse for why they should delay the next regulatory protection. But now that they've got control of power, they want nothing to do with evidence. They want nothing to do with science. They just want to get to their predetermined outcome, which is enabling polluters to pollute more. And as I said, it is an outrage, and it's not just an outrage because the air is going to be dirtier in the abstract. It's an outrage because real people are going to suffer. And the real people, it's all of us, but as is normally the case, it will be concentrated in low-income communities and people of color communities where the most hazardous sites exist, where the most pollution goes on, and where the communities have the least local power to fight back to protect themselves.
Rob Weissman, on Wednesday, Elena Plott, a journalist with The Atlantic, reported she was castigated by EPA spokesperson Jahan Cox when she asked for comment on the resignation of one of Pruitt's top aides. Wilcox reportedly told Plott, "You're a piece of trash." Meanwhile, a former top attorney for the chemical industry has been named to lead the Environmental Protection Agency's Superfund task force. Stephen Cook, who worked for 2 decades at the chemical giant LyondellBasell, Think Progress reports Cook will now be responsible for overseeing the cleanup of Superfund sites polluted by his former employer. Rob.
Yeah, so both those stories are reflective of what's going on at the EPA. The first, again, this hostility to journalists for just reporting on what's going on. Again, also following the lead from the White House, of course. And in the second, part of this grand story throughout the Trump administration of bringing in industry to be in charge of industry officials or former lawyers for industry to then come into government and be in charge of regulating the companies that they once worked for. It's not just this guy from the chemical industry. It's also this chemical industry scientist I mentioned. It's also a coal lobbyist who's now the number 2 at EPA.
This is Andrew Wheeler.
It's other officials who came from oil and gas. That's
right. If you can talk about this. So for him to be number 2, that means if Scott Pruitt is forced out,
that's right.
That Andrew Wheeler, who's worked for nearly a decade on behalf of fossil fuel companies, including the coal company Murray Energy, approved by the Senate in April, becomes second in command and would become the EPA administrator, at least for a time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we absolutely think that Scott Pruitt should be impeached. It's a bit of a power game now in D.C. to see if he can hold on. The White House wants him to go, but not the most important person in the White House, the president. Increasingly, Republican members of Congress are saying, look, this is just an embarrassment. We got to get rid of this guy. So, and we think Congress should do its duty and force him out through impeachment. But we have to be honest and recognize what that means. We're going to probably have Pruitt exit the scene and have a coal industry lobbyist come and be in charge of the EPA.
Finally, Pruitt rolling back Obama-era fuel standards. Very briefly, if you could explain what that is.
So the most important thing that President Obama did to deal with climate change was not the Clean Power Plan. It was increasing the fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks. It was being done in 2 phases. And it's just a win-win. It's going to massively reduce the amount of carbon pollution that goes in the air by also reducing the amount of gas that our cars need. It's going to save consumers a huge amount of money. Pruitt is now trying to roll back the second phase of that. The cost in dollar terms to consumers would be more than $100 billion, let alone the impact on climate change.
Well, Rob Weissman, I want to thank you for being with us, president of Public Citizen. Last year, Public Citizen launched corporatecabinet.org, a website tracking the corporate connections and conflicts of interest of the Trump cabinet appointees. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Gaza, where thousands of Palestinians have resumed protests against the Israeli blockade, Israeli soldiers have killed at least 119 Palestinians and wounded more than 13 others since the Palestinians' nonviolent Great March of Return protests began on March 30th. A week ago today, Israeli forces shot dead Israeli medic Hazan al-Najjar as she was helping evacuate wounded Palestinians at a protest near the separation fence between Israel and Gaza. At the time of her killing, she was wearing a white medical coat and a medical ID card. The following day, thousands of people poured into the streets of Gaza to attend her funeral. The Palestinian medic's killing has also sparked international outrage. Earlier this week, the Israeli military said Israeli snipers had not intentionally shot at Razan, but now the Israeli military is facing widespread criticism after it released a short video Thursday that was heavily edited edited in efforts to claim that the slain Palestinian medic was acting as a human shield for Hamas when she was shot dead by an Israeli sniper. The video, posted by the Israeli Defense Forces, appears to show Razan throwing a smoke grenade into an empty field. The words on the video read, "This medic was incited by Hamas to give up her life for their goals." It's then followed by a short clip of the Palestinian medic, Razan al-Najjar, speaking.
I'm the paramedic Razan al-Najjar. I'm here at the front lines as a rescuing human shield.
After Razan speaks, the words on the video read, "Hamas uses paramedics as human shields." After the video was released, the Israeli military spokesman, Avichai Adrai, tweeted, "Razan al-Najjar is not the angel of mercy that Hamas propaganda attempts to portray," unquote. But the video has sparked immediate criticism for taking Razan's words from a previous interview out of context in order to distort their meaning. This is a clip from the original interview in which Razan is being interviewed by a journalist with Al Mayadeen News.
Razan, the idea of becoming a paramedic, how did that idea start for you? Tell us, was it your own idea only? Did it cross through your mind? Tell us, if you may, please.
I'm the paramedic Razan al-Najjar. I'm here at the front lines as a rescuing human shield to protect and save the wounded at the front lines. Indeed, this idea was not suggested to me by anybody. I did it from my own self, because I opted to go through this adventure and try rescuing the wounded at the front lines. I have enough strength, courage, and daring to go through this experience, to join the field and be prepared to go to ground zero to save the souls of our martyrs and some of our wounded. They are our brothers, of course. And praise to God, I managed with all my determination, persistence, and strength to continue on this course that I started, and I will end. And I've been persistent for 45 days.
So that was Razan al-Najjar speaking in her own words about her efforts to rescue wounded Palestinian protesters wounded by the Israeli military. Earlier this week, we spoke with Razan's cousin, Dalia al-Najjar.
Razan was a very strong-minded girl since she was very young. She always had dreams. She loved life. She was a source of positivity all the time. And being a nurse was one of her dreams. She worked hard to be one. She couldn't get a degree in nursing, unfortunately, because of the financial situations her family were living under. And then she went and got a training in nursing for 2 years, and she worked as a volunteer for 2 years without being paid. And then she felt it's her duty to be a first responder, because it's everyone's duty. Everyone has a role in what's going on, and she felt that she can do what she's best at by being a first responder. She was one of the first female first responders, and she inspired many people. I heard stories from her colleagues saying that other first responders used to motivate each other by mentioning her and talking about her. If anyone is sitting, they would tell him, "Come on." Razan broke her wrist, and yet she completed her shift. So she's a source of inspiration for everyone.
That was Razan al-Najjar's cousin, Dalia al-Najjar. We reached her in Istanbul, Turkey, where she's co-founder of Zyla Water, an organization dedicated to making clean water accessible around the world. Well, for more, we go to Sweden via Democracy Now! Video stream to speak with Mohammed Shahada, writer and activist from the Gaza Strip, student of development studies at Lund University in Sweden. He writes for Haaretz, The Forward, and other publications. Mohammed, talk about this video that the Israeli military has released a week after Razan was gunned down by an Israeli sniper.
Well, this incident shows how the IDF evidently feels able to, first of all, lie so blatantly in a way that can be checked so easily, because it knows that the Western media and the Western reporters would catch the bait and convey its lies as unquestioned facts, or at least as credible narratives, For instance, the New York Times reported about this specific incident or this specific controversy as opposing narratives between the real video and what the IDF claims. Any reporter could simply just go on YouTube and check the full interview for her or himself. But the problem is that, again, they won't do that. It's a betrayal not only of heroism, not only of the courage and sacrifice of the Palestinian people, it's just a betrayal of basic journalistic values. As you have seen in the footage, the IDF footage, according to the shamelessly fabricated and doctored video, Razan was saying very ironically that she's standing as a human shield. Her specific use of that word, human shield, was obviously intended to take a dehumanizing term that is widely deployed by the IDF to justify the killing of innocent civilians. And she used it to make it into something so powerful and touching that couldn't be ignored. It is decisive and conclusive that there is no chance the IDF did edit and doctor that video in good faith or by accident. It was purposeful to cut this interview after 2 seconds of what she says in order to falsify her own words. If the IDF, or had they just lengthened the clip by 1 second, one more word, the whole story would have been unraveled. But the problem is that instead the first murder, an unarmed, clearly marked paramedic with precision weaponry, then they claimed that it was an accident, and finally they claimed that even accidents are directed by God to occur only to bad people, so the victim's death is justified. It appears that under no circumstance whatsoever would Israel acknowledge the Palestinians' suffering. We are never allowed to be seen as victims. It is as if Israel cannot tolerate another story of dispossession and misery to exist alongside it. So intolerance is constantly reinforced through the Israeli forces' hostilities toward the Gazan civilian population, and now the deliberate discretion of their sacred memories. The least the IDF could have done in that incident is to show remorse, to say that we were wrong for the execution of an innocent female paramedic. But sometimes there is enough honor in losing a battle than snatching a defeating and false victory. Instead, from the first moment, as you have seen, the IDF invested disproportionate time and effort to contextualize and find a pretext for this horrendous war crime, then to hold the perpetrators accountable. The problem is that, as always, the calamities visited upon the Palestinians are either denied, ridiculed, or sometimes even cheered and applauded. There is always an internal investigation to be open, a relief from blame. And this investigation is either never concluded, as in the case of the young martyr, 14-year-old protester Muhammad Ayoub, who died through the protest, or the findings of these reports are rather more appalling than the incident itself. One of the findings is that it never happened, just plain and simple, some IDF reports say. As in the case of Ahmed Tamimi's cousin Muhammad, his medical record, his X-ray, eyewitnesses, everybody confirms that his head was shattered by Israeli live bullets directed towards him. But according to the IDF, he fell off his bike. It never happened.
Mohammed, I want to turn to that story for a moment. On Wednesday, the Palestinian Information Ministry saying Israeli forces shot dead the 21-year-old Palestinian Ezzeladin al-Tamimi in the West Bank village of Nabi Salah. He was a member of the prominent Tamimi family, which is well known for its resistance to the Israeli occupation. This is Mahmoud al-Tamimi, a relative of the young man who was killed, Ezzeladin.
Israeli occupation forces raided a site near the gas station. When he ran away, they identified him and shot him directly with live ammunition. 3 bullets in his neck and chest. Then they beat him, and he was bleeding before they moved his body to a military vehicle, where he was left for a long time before being pronounced dead.
Another member of the Tamimi family, 17-year-old Ahad Tamimi, remains imprisoned on charges of slapping an Israeli soldier in a video that went viral. Earlier this week, a parole board rejected her appeal for an early release. She's really become a global face of the resistance to occupation. Mohammed Shahada, if you'd continue with, I mean, we're not just talking about, I mean, what we're talking about here, over 120 Palestinians killed since March 30th, since the nonviolent March of Return. Ghazan, female paramedics and medical people have been hit so hard. I wanted to go back to an excerpt of an interview we did a few weeks ago. This was the day after the U.S. moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. And I think the Israeli military killed more than 60 Palestinians in Gaza that day. I want to turn to Tarek Loubani. He's a Canadian emergency room doctor who went to Gaza to help wounded Palestinians. This is an excerpt of what he had to say. He was shot by Israeli sniper in both legs.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what orders they received or what was in their heads. So I can't tell you if we were deliberately targeted. What I can tell you is the things that I do know. In the 6 weeks of the march, there were no paramedic casualties. And in one day, 19 paramedics, 18 wounded plus 1 killed, and myself were all injured. Or were all shot with live ammunition. Musa was actually in a rescue at the time, but everybody else I've talked to was like me. We were away during a lull without smoke, without any chaos at all, and we were targeted, and we were rather hit by live ammunition, most of us in the lower limbs. So it's very, very hard to believe that the Israelis who shot me and the Israelis who shot my other colleagues, just from our medical crew, 4 of us were shot, including Musa Abu Hassanin, who passed away. It's very hard to believe that they didn't know who we were, they didn't know what we were doing, and that they were aiming at anything else.
So that is Dr. Tarek Loubani. I mean, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke out about this. He was shot in both legs. And the man he just mentioned, the paramedic Musa, who went to save him, was shot dead an hour later. Mohammed Shahada, if you can continue to talk about the coverage of what has taken place in Gaza and also what is happening today as we speak. Thousands are protesting in Gaza.
Well, as I said, the coverage of the Gazan protest or actual particular incidents like Razan, it concludes 3 different dehumanizing and equally appalling indications. One is that it never happened. There is the unarguably racist, dehumanizing, and hideous term Pallywood that is coined and going viral to imply that the entire Palestinian population are consistently conniving and contriving staged major lies to defame Israel and exert an understandable anger or hatred, as they call it, of its illegal occupation and criminal blockade. The absurdity of this horrendous term dishonors only its authors and advocates. But the other conclusion is that it wasn't us. As you have seen in the case of the double amputee Ibrahim Abu Thuraya, the IDF concluded that the bullet that landed in his forehead was not coming from their own ammunition. Another racist term is coined here to describe Ibrahim's death as self-inflicted suffering. The entire population of Palestine are perceived as masochistics who find joy in getting killed, maimed, or crippled by the IDF, and whose main goal is, of course, to make their wish come true without a second thought. The Israeli intelligence apparently managed to dig into Ibrahim's heart and to conclude his intentions that his death was entirely self-inflicted. It was his own fault because he was, quote, an agitator who wanted to die as a martyr. And they indeed purposefully overlook the fact that even if Ibrahim for once in his life contemplated death as a relief from the insufferable misery that he endured, it was mainly because the IDF first shot his legs, both of them stole his legs and stole his life, because Israel's blockade turned his life into unbearable hell. He spent his golden years crawling on the floors, begging for bare-bones subsistence. The third conclusion, which is what we are now seeing in Razan's case and in the case of the Palestinian journalist Yasser Mortaja, is that it was an accident. And it comes from a deep and evident wishful thinking that if you presume the IDF to be the most moral army in the world, you can never conclude that they did this on purpose. By no means the most moral army in the world would do such thing. The IDF stated at the beginning of the protest that it knows where every bullet shot at the protest landed, maybe except for the ones that when it's convenient for them to claim otherwise, like in the particular case of Razan. You see that they say first she was shot by accident. The bullet apparently was shot in the air and bounced back and accurately shattered her heart. And even incidents that happened by accident, according to the IDF definition, only happened to bad people, as they called them. So the IDF, instead of investigating the actual incident or the accident, seemed to spend great time and effort trying to prove an alleged affiliation between the victims and dehumanizing categories that would justify their killing.
Mohammed Shahada, we want to end today's segment with the words of the celebrity chef and television presenter Anthony Bourdain. We just learned today he's died by suicide in Strasbourg, France, as he was filming one of his episodes of his very popular show, Parts Unknown. He traveled to Gaza. In 2014, he won an award from the Muslim Public Affairs Council. This was his speech.
I was enormously grateful for the response from Palestinians in particular, for doing what seemed to me an ordinary thing, something we do all the time, show regular people doing everyday things. The world has visited many terrible things on the Palestinian people, none more shameful than robbing them of their basic humanity. People are not statistics. That is all we attempted to show.
Those are the words of Anthony Bourdain, again died by suicide this morning in Strasbourg, France, as he was filming one of his episodes for Parts Unknown for CNN. I want to thank Mohammed Shahada, writer and activist from the Gaza Strip, a student of development studies at Lund University in Sweden. He writes for Haaretz, The Forward, and other publications. We'll link to his pieces at democracynow.org. When we come back, the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, has just announced a ceasefire with the Taliban. We'll speak with peace activist Kathy Kelly. Stay with us.
في بينا أمل للتحرير نحلم فيه، في بينا وعي لازم نحارب فيه، في بينا قدس محتاجة فينا النور، في بينا وطن أمل فينا بالتحرير.
ننافس في حياتنا أصعب وضع فنجتهد نكافح فسادنا نطمع، بنستسلمش بنفوض الجريمة الطمع، تسرق حقي وكرامتك بالمجتمع. بدنا منظرة حصد ومن جد وجد، مش منظرة ما حصد ومن جد لا يجد. بدناش نقول مين بتعرف مش إيش بتعرف، تبدأ القصة من حقك إنه لازم تعرف. نشوف شاب ماخد تقدير مش محصل إنه يكون أي فرصة.
We Have Hope by Revolution Makers here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we end today's show in Afghanistan, where Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has announced an unconditional ceasefire with the Taliban, to last until June 20th. This was President Ghani's first unconditional offer of a ceasefire since his election in 2014. The U.S. has said it'll honor the ceasefire against the Taliban. We go to Chicago, where we're joined by Kathy Kelly, co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, a campaign to end U.S. military and economic warfare. She has made many trips to Afghanistan and just returned from Afghanistan this week. Kathy, if you can explain what's just taken place, how significant is this ceasefire?
Well, it's very difficult to imagine a ceasefire with the multiple groups of insurgents in Afghanistan today. The Taliban are certainly the strongest, but they are one group amongst many insurgent groups who have made steady attacks all through the year. And so it's a very, very tense time. But a lasting peace in Afghanistan would require a way to deal with the destitution, with the unemployment, with the inability of people to feed their families, because it's in part because of that kind of desperation that people turn to joining military groups, police groups, because that's the only way sometimes that they can get an income. Plus, very, very tragically, now 21 out of 34 provinces in Afghanistan are drought-stricken. So conditions are so harsh, so hard, and in Kabul, it's become the least safe place in Afghanistan. I just returned from that city, and in a visit in a refugee camp, you get the sense of exhaustion, desperation, and an inability of the Afghan government to respond.
So ISIS claimed responsibility for a recent suicide attack that killed 14 clerics at a peace summit in Kabul. What happened? And was this the spark for President Ghani?
Well, it's called the Loya Jirga, and people were gathering to declare a fatwa against suicide bombings, and then a suicide attacker had managed to get inside, and that was when the clerics were killed. I think that Ashraf Ghani, perhaps right now, is very aware that the Taliban have been able to surround various cities in Afghanistan and in some cases take over the cities temporarily. And so he is offering this ceasefire, perhaps knowing that talks might at this point be indispensable for his government to continue. But included in his government are various warlords and sons of warlords, and so it's a very, very tense time. Also, I think many people in Afghanistan are aware that President Trump has publicly opposed negotiations and talks with the Taliban, and he has expressed his interest in what's going on in Afghanistan under the ground, not in terms of the water level lowering and the desperation in a time of drought to gain access to water, but he is interested in the rare earth minerals and other precious.
Before we go, I want to ask you, BBC's reporting, since Trump announced the new Afghan strategy committed more troops to the conflict, the number of bombs dropped by the U.S. Air Force has surged dramatically. New rules of engagement have made it easier for U.S. forces to carry out strikes against the Taliban. You wrote Donald Trump's interest in what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan is focused exclusively on the U.S. capacity to extract Afghanistan's mineral wealth. In this last minute we have, can you talk about these two issues?
Well, one person from the Wardak province, when I was last in Afghanistan, said when I asked, well, how is your family? You know, this is a area where the strikes are so heavy. He said, we can't find space to bury the dead. There have been so many bombings. And yet, you know, I think President Trump's main interest in maintaining troops within Afghanistan has to do with being able to control the possible extraction of wealth under the Hindu Kush Mountains in the future, and also being able to send signals to China and to Russia that the United States still has a foothold in that country.
We're going to leave it there, but we're going to continue our conversation with you and post it as a web exclusive at DemocracyNow.org. Kathy Kelly, just back from Afghanistan, co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, a campaign to end U.S. military and economic warfare. She's made many trips to Afghanistan. That does it for our show. To see our video and audio podcasts and our transcripts, go to DemocracyNow.org. Democracy Now! Is accepting applications for our paid video production fellowship. victims. Find out more at democracynow.org and sign up for our daily digest, our news digest. Send the word Democracy Now! To the number 66866. Democracy Now! One word to 66866. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Noreen Shea, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining.